As you can see from this story, letting other people know, being a part of their support system, telling them how important they are, and spreading that feeling of positiveness and optimism around can and does make a difference in the lives that you touch. Even a simple thing, such as giving an award or a ribbon, can make a huge difference in a person's life, or perhaps, as happened in that story that you just heard, even save that life. Now let's look at some of the personal resiliency and vulnerability variables that we might be able to use either to foster or to help people avoid so that they can develop greater resilience. Resiliency and vulnerability variables are both internal and external. There are some, such as family supports, social and financial resources, and so forth, that are outside of the individual. The internal factors are sometimes difficult to observe, but they include things like coping style, a person's mental health history, their ability to regulate their emotions, how effective they are at relating to others, and their developmental level. Those who are less resilient usually require a lot more services and a lot more support than those with greater resilience. So it can also help us to predict who will need interventions and who will need extra supports. Some of the external resiliency factors, things that increase resilience from the outside of the individual, include having family resources available. Things like living with a nuclear family member or members, like caring and effective parenting, like extended family and the relationships with those family members and the guidance that one can receive from a positive extended family, like caregivers who cope well with trauma and grief and loss themselves, because those modeling experiences can help a person know how to cope when they experience loss. Social resources that are available to the individual, things like having close friendships and peer relationships, access to positive adults, especially for kids, connection with pro-social institutions like religious institutions and community support institutions and other institutions that foster togetherness, like scouting and boys and girls clubs, that foster a sense of community and that encourage pro-social behaviors and activities. Also, having adequate financial resources is an important external facilitator of resilience. Those things that make it more difficult to acquire resilience and that make an individual vulnerable from an external perspective are things like not having a supportive family, not living with nuclear family members as long as, or having nuclear family members who are uncaring, ineffective, or even abusive, family dysfunction, having parents who are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or other anxiety disorders. This can be particularly relevant for the family members of those returning from stints in the military, especially if they've been in a war zone. Child maltreatment or abuse or exposure to domestic violence. Having social resources which are lacking or unavailable or insufficient, being socially isolated, not having enough friends or any positive quality of friendships, a perceived lack of social support, and having unavailable or inadequate financial resources can be devastating to some individuals. There are also a number of internal resiliency factors, things that foster resiliency and that are internal to the individual, things like an interactive and positive and pro-social coping style, positive mental health, and mental hygiene, things that foster mental health and foster well-being, good physical health, and good physical health and behavioral health habits, like eating well and sleeping well and regular exercise, things like that. Good self-regulation of emotions, and as you know, one of the functions of mental health practitioners is to teach effective emotional regulation. Developmental maturity and higher IQ are internal factors that predict positive reactions to trauma and grief. Adaptive coping with prior trauma and being exposed to adaptive models of coping with trauma and loss and grief. Higher self-esteem, as we mentioned before. The greater the self-esteem, as long as it's not narcissistic, the better the potential coping. An internal locus of control, and adaptive or facilitative religious belief systems or other spiritual beliefs that foster coping, that foster resiliency, that contribute to the belief that things can work out and that there are ways that one can cope, even in the direst of emergencies and the greatest of distresses. Then there are those internal vulnerability factors which tend to parallel the supportive or protective factors, things like an avoidant or non-interactive coping style, pre-existing mental illness or predisposition to mental illness, chronic physical illness or physical breakdowns or frequent physical damage or accidents. Emotional dysregulation, not being able to control one's feelings and emotions effectively or to channel them effectively into productive activity. Developmental delay or immaturity and lower IQ. History of prior traumatization without effective resolution or without effective resilience. Low self-esteem, external locus of control, and rigid dogmatic belief systems or belief systems that foster maladaptive coping strategies or even destructive modes of problem solving and coping. Payne's research in 2002 indicates that individuals with a high number of developmental assets, like those that we just mentioned, both the internal assets and the external ones, are likely to engage less often in risky behaviors, and they're more likely to succeed in school and or at work and to maintain good health, in addition to being better problem solvers. One of the most important factors in determining how a child will respond to distress, grief, and trauma and loss is the reaction or reactions of adults around that child, particularly the most important adults in the child's life. Modeling is critical to the development of resiliency and to effective problem solving. Reactions of people who are significant in that child or adolescent's life will set the tone for how they respond to emergencies and crises. If the adult views the crisis as non-threatening because they can't understand the problem or they don't grasp the potential danger, that's not a very effective coping style. If they overreact, they may increase fear or dysfunction in the child. They may make that child or adolescent more vulnerable to understanding the magnitude of a crisis or threat, and may make them more susceptible to stressors with greater cognitive development as they move along in their developmental process. So the modeling features, the modeling to which the child has been exposed in his or her life is critical in how they'll react. And lots of research tells us that the way in which important adults in the child's life react to that child's behavior or to the trauma will be far better predictors of the child's coping strategies and their resiliency than the actual nature of the trauma itself or the threat that's posed by the trauma. Children are far more influenced by being exposed to parental reactions to crisis than by being exposed to the crisis itself. And if one could summarize the research on resiliency and what fosters resiliency in children and adolescents, the best summary would be that having two or more consistently caring, non-abusive, responsible adults in a child or adolescent's life builds resiliency. And that's critical because we can be one of those adults for a child, an adolescent, or hopefully for many children and many adolescents. That's our responsibility as helping professionals, and it's a way in which we can give back to our community and to our society. Neil Postman, one of my professors at New York University, who's now deceased, wrote in his excellent book, The Disappearance of Childhood, "Children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see." How true that is, how important it is for us to provide good role models for those messages to a time we will not see, how important it is for us to be the resilience builders in our children and adolescents who will carry on in the next generation and determine how our culture will respond to trauma and crisis. How does one build resilience and develop positive responses to trauma and crisis at school and at work? Well, there are several things that research has indicated are effective in helping people in work situations and in school situations promote resilience. One, of course, is connectedness. Feeling a part of the work environment, feeling a part of the school environment. Environments that foster a feeling of belonging and of connectedness are environments which will adapt better and respond better in times of stress and crisis. Helping the individual and the group in school or at work feel a sense of security, feel that they're safe, will help them to respond to crisis even if that crisis breaches the security and breaches the sense of safety. It's really important for kids to feel that they're going to be okay at school. And if they're not, that sense of having been okay and will help the child interpret the crisis as an extraordinary one-time event rather than as a condition of their lives. Fostering a sense of personal value, making sure that employees or students realize that they're valued, realize that they're an important part of the school or the job or the work environment, realize that they're counted on to accomplish things and they're believed in, that the bosses, the administrators are convinced that they can do the job or that they can do the work is really important in developing resilience. And developing overall in the workforce, among the student body, a feeling of competency is critical. That is, we can solve problems. We can make things happen. We can do good work. We can please our teachers or our bosses, and we can compete effectively in a competitive world. We know what we're doing, we know how to do it, and we're convinced that we can make good things happen. Those kinds of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors foster resilience at work, in the schools.